First of all, my apologies for a very primitive image here in a media lab of all places, but I had a lot of chaos going on at home in the last few weeks and I haven't been able to put it on a memory stick or something of that sort. What I'm going to do is to start off with this image and use it as a model. It came out of an earlier book, an introduction to phenomenology called Experimental Phenomenology, which has just been republished in a second larger edition, in which I look at the phenomenon of multistability in a number of different kinds of areas. In the older book, what I did was to deconstruct, as it were, a lot of visual multistable objects in a phenomenological rather than usual empirical psychological vein. And I'm going to use that as a model today to move into the area of computer games, screens, etc. So let's start off with this primitive image. What you have here is a drawing, and I'm going to give you several interpretations of this simple drawing. The first one is, imagine this as a proscenium stage. As you're sitting in an audience someplace and you're looking at the stage, and the actors, of course, walk around on this platform, and this is the backdrop to the platform. Now, if you see it in this way, of course, what you notice is that it's three-dimensional. This is slanted out towards you, the backdrop is in the back, and so you have a three-dimensional, I'll call it three-dimensional rear, in which this configuration is in the rear. Now, this is the object correlate, so to speak. This is what is seen out in the world, etc. But note that correlated with it is an implied position from which you are viewing this proscenium stage. It is not just anywhere. In fact, what it's doing is implying that you're sort of possibly in the first row of the balcony looking down at the proscenium stage, so that there is an implied bodily position in relation to the stage. So this is the first route. The second variation, phenomenological variation, if you will, is let's change it now to being a Mayan pyramid in South America. And as a Mayan pyramid, this now is towards you. You're sort of up here in a helicopter looking down at the Mayan pyramid. And here's where all the sacrificial victims get their hearts carved out and so forth. And now these sides are pointing down so that you've brought this part forward. So you have three-dimensional forward variation in this particular case. So now you've got a reversible, two-variable kind of situation. Now note one thing about this. You can't have them both at the same time. They are alternative, and they are different, either rear or forward facing 3D. But now I'll give you a third interpretation. The third interpretation is, imagine this is not either a stage or a Mayan pyramid, but is in fact a headless robot. If the robot had a head, it would be up here. Since it's headless, it has a problem. It can't see, so it has arms, legs, and crutches on which to walk on the ground. And so now it comes directly forward to you, and it now is 2D. So now we have three variations on this simple multi-stable phenomenon. I'm going to use this as the model of the screen. Now, in each case, remember that we also have, in addition to the screen, is the implied bodily position of the viewer, either directly in front of the robot, elevated over the Mayan pyramid, or sitting in the balcony watching the proscenium stage. All right, now let's switch to screens. Obviously, one of the things that happens with computer games, video games, etc., is the prominence and the central focal position of the screen. Now, the interesting thing about this is if you look at this historically, and if you look at it both in terms of the history of video display screens and a longer history, what you see is that it lies in the trajectory of what I shall call the tablet. In the history of writing, for example, I have a chapter on that in this book, or some references to it in this book. If you go way back, the origins of writing include what I call hard technologies. That is, if you're doing cuneiform, you're using a clay tablet which gets baked, etc. If you're using brush and calligraphy, you use a brush, etc. In each case, you have a screen correlate, which is the tablet, that upon which something is written. And then you have a writing instrument, either the hard wedge-shaped situation with a cuneiform, or a brush, let's say, with calligraphy, or things of that sort. Now, what's interesting in this very long history is that you go from, let's say, hard technologies of scratchings on rocks, cuneiform tablets, etc., to soft technologies of paper, etc., and then eventually to the display screen. Now let's look at the display screen in terms of its history very, very briefly. At first, of course, one of the first uses of visual display screens was for word processing. Let's look at it and compare to the other kinds of tablets that proceeded. For one thing, in the word processing, early word processing equipment, the background of the screen is opaque. It's usually dark. The early ones had green, sort of like the Pong games, etc., and then they transferred to amber with the Princeton monitor, etc., and then finally, of course, to the multicolor kinds of screens that we have today. But for word processing, you have it like one of the variations on this object of an opaque background on which the letters appear. And of course, you're typing through your keyboard to have your article or whatever it is you're writing appear on the screen. So I'm going to call this the screen correlate the opaque version, where you have the screen is simply opaque, it's two-dimensional, the letters or whatever it is that you're doing pop out on the screen in the lighted foreground form of green, amber, or multicolors. But as with this, there is another possibility. This is the second multistability. Let's say that you're playing some sort of computer game. In this case, the screen does not seem to be opaque, but you're looking through the screen into the distance and seeing whatever kinds of movements are occurring in the game that is configured and made graphic through the screen. So this is like the second variation of this. One is the flat one in the first case. The second one is through the screen into cyberspace in the second case. And the third case is merely a modification of that. It may be better or worse 3D, and may be better or worse far or close distance. Now, just as with this model that I'm using, it also implies a position of the user. Now, in all of the cases, the objective position, so to speak, is easy to determine because you're seated in front of the screen. You have your keyboard, your mouse, or whatever mediating tools which are equivalent to the writing tools of the other example, which you're then producing results on, through, or far beyond in the screen per se. Now, so here we have, like this, a series of variations of the screen. Seeing on the screen, seeing through the screen, seeing far through the screen, etc. In the best condition, let's say, a very good 3D kind of dimensionality through the screen. The positionality, the objective positionality, of course, is very restricted. There you are sitting, etc. Now, what this means, for one thing, is that you also have a series of possible points of view. One point of view is the first-person shooter game, in which what you have in front of you is you see, as if you had your hand out there, whatever weapon you've chosen to zap whatever villains it is that you are zapping. I'm going to call this the embodied position because it's as if you were seeing your arm extended in front of you. Then a second position could be called, in some sense, the disembodied position. When I first played aircraft simulation games, my son and I both played them, and we had a very different attitude and take upon these simulation games. I chose the embodied position. I wanted to take off, fly, come back, and land in the proper position as if I were really flying an airplane. He chose the disembodied position, which is, of course, seeing the airplane out there and imagining yourself in the airplane out there. And so the first thing he wanted to do was to crash the plane into some building, in this case in Chicago, whereas I thought that was a terrible thing to do. I wanted to find my way back, and in fact, I got lost. So I had a hard time learning how to get back to the airport accordingly. Now, the disembodied position has the following implication. In the disembodied position, I would claim that you don't have a full bodily sense. That is, for example, in my phenomenology classes that I used to teach many, many years ago, I would ask the class to imagine doing something that they would like to do but had never actually done, and then give a description of those events. Well, it turned out that something like 70% of the classes would choose some variation upon flying, either Superman flying kind of stuff, or in many cases it had to do with parachute jumping, free fall parachute jumping. Now, in the embodied position, of course, if you imagine yourself jumping out of a plane, what do you see? Well, you see the earth coming up towards you in your falling position. You feel the vertigo in your stomach, etc. You feel the air passing across your face, etc. In the disembodied position, you see the plane out there and a figure jumps out of the plane with the parachute, etc. But I would claim that you can't feel the vertigo, etc., out there. It remains in here in the embodied position. So the disembodied position has a different sense of positionality in relation to it. The same thing I would say is the case with computer games. Now, in between being objectified and out there in that position, you can have what I call the alterity or piggyback position, and which yesterday a lot of people talk about avatars. Now, note that the avatars are sort of very close in front of you, and you're seeing the backside. So you're projecting yourself in a kind of quasi position, which is sort of halfway between being way out there and being in the embodied position. So you see the backside of the avatar, whether it's a skier doing ski jumps, or whether it's a shooter which is out there, etc. So here again, you have these various variants upon bodily positionality and upon the object correlate of the world which is out there. Now note that something is interesting here, because between the objective position of you sitting in a chair in front of a screen, etc., the world has to take on a very interesting shape. It always has to move because you're stable, and so the world moves with you in relation to the interning that somebody referred to yesterday. It's the world that has to move. There's a dialectic, in other words, between stability and motion, which is going to be related to one of these kinds of variants. And each one of the variants shows a different kind of stability and motion. Now let me draw from an earlier example. The first major deep cultural examination that I did of multistability had to do with alternative modes of navigation when you're sailing. If you are a Westerner, what you do is you pretend that you have an overhead view, the third-person overhead ideal view, from which you are looking at a map-like world and plotting your course accordingly. I call this the reading position because I think it comes out of the practice of reading texts, etc., and having your position be above the text and imagining it accordingly in that way. If you're a South Pacific navigator, you're sort of like in the position of the first-person shooter in the computer game, because you take your body as the stable position. And so the language changes, for example. You don't say, I am going to Tahiti, because this implies the overhead position watching your boat go to Tahiti. You say, Tahiti is coming to me, because as you are sailing to Tahiti, you are in the stable position and the world is around you accordingly in relation to that set of dynamics. So this is a rather interesting connection, it seems to me, between the computer game and real life. You have both of these kinds of variations, both of which are possible, and both of which achieve their ends. It turns out that the observational conditions in the South Pacific are quite different than they are in the Atlantic, because you have certain kinds of regularities in the South Pacific that you can't get in the Atlantic. One of which, for example, is during the sailing season, you get a regularity of wave patterns. I've flown over the Pacific many times, and I can look down from the plane and see these absolutely parallel wave patterns. But one of the things that happens when you do this is if you are coming towards an island, the wave begins to refract. And so the experienced navigator can detect this refraction and realize that there is off beyond the horizon an island, and that you steer your boat according to these kinds of wave patterns. That simply does not happen in the Atlantic Ocean, which, frankly speaking, isn't big enough for that to take place. The distances in the Pacific are about 3 times larger than that of the Atlantic. So we developed a different kind of navigational system than did the South Pacific Islanders, both of which pragmatically work, but work very, very different compared to third-person overhead position compared to embodied position in the 2 variations. So I think what I'm trying to imply for you is that computer games, in fact, reflect these macro phenomenological conditions that are possible for humans in their positionality in relation to the correlate which is out there. So just as this model is a very simplified, reduced model of the screen correlate and the implied position, so this also occurs in other kinds of activities which are much more complex and which may or may not include mediation. For example, in the navigational situation, all Westerners use instrumental mediations to translate this overhead position, which they don't actually occupy, to tell them what directions to go, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Whereas South Pacific navigators don't use instruments, although they read the phenomena of nature as if they were instruments. For example, all of the star patterns in the South Pacific are without the North Star. In our system, we always have fixed variables. North Star, magnetic north, et cetera. You don't get that in the South Pacific. You only get dynamic motions. And so you can follow stars to where they set and so forth with very, very simple mathematics and do your navigating accordingly. So what I'm doing is obviously using this as a model and analog to all of these situations. And I would claim that there isn't any major difference between, let's say, the computer world and the real world with respect to these variables of stability dynamics, bodily possibilities, observational possibilities, and the multiplicities of the screen correlate, which is out there. Now, of course, when you get down to the details of stuff, then you have to pay attention clearly to the kinds of mediation which are used. And there we could get engrossed with things like what's the difference between using a joystick and a keyboard versus a mouse, etc. Now I want to switch just a little bit to somewhat of the history of computer games as they fit into this larger phenomenological pattern. If you look at the history of computer games, and this is true of every kind of human technology interaction, One of the things about any human technology interaction is that you have to learn skills. And I claim that these are bodily skills. This is one of the differences between post-phenomenology and classical phenomenology. Post-phenomenologists emphasize bodily skills, bodily experience, et cetera, as over against consciousness and cognitive kinds of processes. So what happens is that in any kind of computer game, and you can see this happening over the history of computer games, you have certain kinds of skills that you need to develop. Now, the early computer games, as everybody knows, emphasized what's called eye-hand coordination. You have relatively small kinds of movements, whether you're using keyboard, joystick, or other kinds of control devices. In each case, what you have to do is to learn how to coordinate what you're seeing on the screen with this hand bodily movement accordingly. Now let's look at some variations outside of computer game situations. I went to a concert, a piano concert in the city a couple weeks ago by Garrick Olson. It was a Liszt concert, and Liszt, of course, is a very romantic composer and has very, very dramatic kinds of motion. If you watch Garrick Olson play, he's very animated, and talk about pounding a keyboard. After the first two pieces, they had to have a tuner come in and retune the piano. That's how active it was. And you just see this guy just pounding the keyboard with basically what I would call whole bodily motion. Now, if you look at a typist, a professional typist, they're very, very fast motion, very, very fast, et cetera. But it's very highly restricted. It's concentrated into the hands and the positionality. So a typist is very far from the whole bodily activity of a pianist, et cetera. Now, the early computer games were sort of more like the typist than the pianist. You're not moving your feet, you're not dancing, et cetera, but you're concentrating on hand-eye coordination. And of course, these skills get developed over time. Now let's look at a spin-off from this. Are these skills good for anything? Because they're clearly highly restricted in comparison to, say, the piano variation or stuff. But they are as a spin-off. One of the things that has been noticed is, for example, in what's called Nintendo surgery. Nintendo surgery is the kind of robotic surgery which happens in laparoscopy processes and so forth and so on. In fact, I've had angioplasty a couple of times with respect to my own bodily situation and have observed Nintendo surgery in the situation. What happens is when you undergo angioplasty, what happens is that there is a tube which is going up through your artery, femoral artery, up all the way to the arteries to your heart, and they're trying to see if there are any blockages, et cetera, and whether they need to put in a stent, which is a little metal tube-like thing that goes in, and I've had one of those implanted. And the surgeon, you have to be awake because there are certain movements that you have to make to allow the tube to move the way it should move inside your artery. So while I'm lying on the table looking sideways, he's got multi-screens up here, and he's looking at the multi-screens, very close to computer game kinds of stuff, and moving the tube inside, which has a thing to cut stuff with, a light to illuminate stuff with, et cetera. Well, it turns out that experienced computer game players are more likely to learn the skills for this kind of Nintendo surgery than people who are not skilled in this process. So here is a kind of interesting spin-off from precisely that kind of activity. Now, if you look at the history of computer games, of course, what you find is that you go more and more and more to larger areas of bodily skills. In the 90s, I was a member of an interdisciplinary research team associated with Learning Lab Denmark. Learning Lab Denmark originally was a spin-off from Lego, Lego was introducing various kinds of games into their business practices, et cetera. And eventually, Learning Lab was absorbed by the Educational University, DPU, in Denmark. And so it still is associated with that. I remained part of this team for quite a few years. Now, one of the things the Danes got interested in was they were worried that the Danish children might turn out like the American children and end up obese because they weren't getting enough exercise. And one of the reasons they weren't getting enough exercise is that they were spending so many hours a week in front of the screen. Now, whether that's a cause of obesity or not, there's at least an indirect correlate. So our task was to dream up what could we do that would still allow computer technologies to be sold, of course, make money for the people, but which would engage larger areas of exercise practice. So we, in fact, we had neurologists, we had psychologists, philosophers, myself included, et cetera, and we would get together and dream up possible technologies. Well, in fact, we dreamed up what today is known both as we and connect type stuff. We didn't invent it, but we had the ideas for how you can engage more whole body activity using screens, et cetera. Some of these are using equivalents of exercise bicycles. Some are using physical activity, et cetera. So in fact, I was back in Denmark in December, and we had a demonstration of some of the new Connect games, which are visual, of course. What they do is they show balls coming at you, and you have to swat them, et cetera. And the people who were doing the swatting, it was very, very interesting because they were out there really doing big swats like this and kicking and so forth. But then as some of the mothers of younger children pointed out, the kids know that the balls are not that accurately geared, so the kids would do and still have minimalist exercise practices in relation to Connect, et cetera. So you could see here there are all these interesting directions which go into things like computer games and the development of bodily skills. Now, of course, once we get to farther developments, we'll probably, one of the problems with screens is this. It's very hard to use a screen to be an actual engaged motion. You could have what's equivalent to a heads-up display helmet and have stuff projected on the helmet and see through it into the outside and therefore walk around, et cetera. But that's still relatively clumsy in relation to normal, ordinary kinds of bodily movement. So I think we're still at a semi-primitive stage with respect to these games, et cetera. But I also want to claim that the phenomenological principles of embodiment relating to multistable phenomena are constant, and they pervade both the virtual realities, et cetera, of computer games and ordinary life kinds of situations. I'm going to conclude a little bit early, and I want to show you one more development of variations. Again, pardon my simple illustration. One of the differences between a phenomenological analysis and standard analyses is that you always go for the maximum number of variations. Now, in the history of recent thinking, there are two major figures who have referred to duck rabbits. One is Wittgenstein, of course, who uses it to show multiplicity, and the other is Thomas Kuhn, who uses it to show paradigm switches. So, okay, here we have a duck, and here we have a rabbit. But here we have a Martian, and then we have a squid. So it is not simply a binary, which in fact almost all of the standard perceptual psychology settle for, is a quaternary. And so I'm going to suggest that those who are interested in stretching the variations take a look at the just out second edition of my experimental phenomenology, which does this in relation to a whole series of historical and even scientific technological developments. One chapter, for example, has to do with multistability in cyberspace, where I talk about the positionality as I did here today. Another has to do with variations on the camera obscura, in which I look at 7 to 8 variations on the camera obscura: light source, aperture, room for the camera, and the screen. Anytime you change anything in one of those variables, you get new phenomena. And so the old-fashioned camera leads to photography, for example, in one direction, but it's all isomorphic imaging, where you take three-dimensional objects and turn them into two-dimensional objects, etc. But if you change and put a prism in there, then you get spectroscopy. If you use twin slits, you get interferometry. And if you use diffraction gratings in a certain way, you get holography. So what you can look at is to see that this long, long history of instrumentation, each variation produces new phenomena, which then become useful for the development and production of scientific knowledge. There are a number of other chapters that address other kinds of things. So with this, I hope that I've convinced you that a phenomenological styled analysis, which goes through multiple variations, taking into account both a world correlate and a bodily position correlate, that you can understand a lot more about what goes on all the way from computer games to ordinary life. Thank you. Please speak up clearly. I have hearing aids which mediate my hearing, and there's a lot of feedback problem with microphones.
Hi, I was wondering if you could expand a bit on the relation of the body of the player with the body on the screen, because it seems that a lot of what you were talking about were navigation, were feeling in the space. But I was thinking of things like, I mean, any guy in this room knows that when you see someone else being kicked in the crotch, you kind of feel it, right? So how does that work in video games? Like seeing things like Mortal Kombat, for example, where there's like spines being ripped off. It's like, are you feeling for that body? Like, what is the connection with that body? When your avatar gets hit, are you feeling the hit or not? Like, is that connection broken or is that connection strengthened? I don't know what your opinions about it are.
Well, if I understand you, I think with respect to avatars, I didn't talk about this very much in my talk, but with respect to avatars, there's always a very, very strong imaginative dimension. And you have to do all kinds of things imaginatively to make those identifications and so forth. So one of the interesting things, I guess, about avatars, I have a book, by the way, which talks a lot about virtual reality called Bodies in Technology, 2002. I think this imaginative thing is actually very interesting, but it's also very, very complex because you're both dissembling and assembling at the same time with any kind of avatar. Now, this is nothing unusual. Let's go back to my variations on the camera obscura. There is no such thing as a perfect semblance. It simply does not happen in the use of any kind of imaging technology. Even if you go to the best example of a really photorealistic photo process, et cetera, it's still reducing three-dimensionality to two-dimensionality. And in recent years, I'm going back to painting, and I'm using various multimedia in the process. And I have learned an incredible amount about how very, very small differences make for fairly large distortions, just in projecting images, for example, to construct portraits, which is what I'm doing right now. And I think the same thing is at play in avatars.
So would your argument go that the same kind of like shifting perspective also applied to how we relate to avatars?
Yeah.
Like, okay, thank you.
Hi. I was wondering about your comparison between the Liszt pianist and the kids playing Connect. Why do you think that the pianist needed such exaggerated full body movements? Why couldn't he have streamlined his emotions the way the kids playing Connect did?
I think we could, developmentally. I mean, if your computer designer wanted to go in a direction which would incorporate that kind of more dramatic notion, you could. I mean, for example, most computer game designs and so forth don't do anything with your feet. Why not? You could. I mean, after all, when you play a piano, you have your pedals for stuff. You could do that. There's no reason why not, but so far people haven't done that.
I'm just curious if post-phenomenology has any consequences for the ontology of space in computer games. I'm thinking that if you take an ordinary action, like Paul walked over to the desk, it is made true by real spatial relations. And if you take a similar description inside a game, that Paul shot an imp, for example, or walked over to the cave or something like that, it seems it's true in one sense, and I wonder what makes it true. What is, given that this is a real embodiment, this is an execution of real skill. Do you have any opinions on what the status of the implied space is? Is it a fictional space or is it something else?
I think if I understood you, a great deal of what I would do in relation to that kind of question is to have us be brought up to date with space-time understandings. I sometimes get the feeling in conferences that most people are still living in a Laplacian universe, in which there's a lot of determination, in which there is a kind of separation of spatial and temporal dimensions, etc. I don't think that's the universe we live in anymore. I think we live in a relativistic quantum universe which has a lot of indeterminacy and transformability to spatial temporal kinds of experience. One of the things that's always struck me, I've sometimes thought I'd do an article on this but haven't, is if you look at Einstein's thought experiments, it's quite interesting because they always include some sort of bodily example. I mean, the equivalence of acceleration with some other phenomena, he uses a guy in an elevator. You can't, depending on what kind of speed you are in the elevator. Or if you're watching the relativity of time, etc., it's always in relation to some kind of positionality of the observer, etc. So I think we need to rethink this kind of framework and apply it, if you will, to things like computer development, computer games, etc.
Thank you very much. Very interesting, of course. I think this is mediating my agency somewhat problematically. I hope you can hear me. I was reminded of the arguments against the Ames room kind of experiments during your talk, and I'm going to put this question to you. Don't these multi-stable representations depend upon the same kind of fixation of viewpoint that the Ames room experiment depends upon, in the sense that the somewhat phenomenological Gibsonian argument against that kind of multistability is that if the observer is actually able to move, the multi-stable relations fall apart. In this case, if I move, and this is a real object, not just a stable representation, occlusion cues would tell me whether this is in fact a proscenium stage or am I in all of these things. So my question is, isn't it that interactive representations such as one we find in video games are not multi-stable, but rather fixed in their way of representing space, since we are able to manipulate them in a kind of Merleau-Pontian way? You can actually go to the backside of the lamp.
I don't think that multistability disappears. I grant that there's a kind of sliding scale.
Okay.
For example, one of the secrets of this and the duck, rabbit, squid, etc. things that I showed you was that in each case, the drawings to emphasize, to amplify the multistability has to do with a kind of abstraction. I grant that. And it's much harder to do that when you start, as you say, using dynamic bodily motion per se, etc. But I don't think it disappears. For example, let me use another chapter example that I have. One of the things I've noticed in the history of technologies is that most of them end up having relatively simple components, but with very, very minor variations can produce vast different outcomes. And one of the examples I use in my new book is what I call the seventh machine, which is the bow under tension. Now, the bow under tension, most of you would recognize immediately as archery. Archery, interestingly enough, was independently discovered by virtually every society, human society on the face of the earth, with a few exceptions. Australians went to boomerangs instead. Some jungle tribes went to blowguns instead, etc. But almost, I mean, archery is in Asia, archery is in Europe, archery is in North America, etc. And my own investigations show that archery was in use at least as far back as the Ice Age, because there are some Ice Age representations of people with bows. So now, most people, I think, would be satisfied to say, well, archery has this interesting multicultural history, etc. But what they don't notice is that there's another trajectory to the bow under tension, and it's the stringed instrument. Well, it turns out that Bushmen, and there are cave drawings of this back at least 3,000 years ago, Bushmen would take their bows like this, pluck them as they go hunting, and sing songs. And then they would add resonators to the bottom of the bow, and sometimes they would take a second bow and play the first bow, etc. And then all you have to do is start adding strings, and you have another trajectory which develops. So I think that, in other words, I'm trying to say, even in material culture, even in bodily practices, there is this multistability which is potentially there.
I agree completely. Sort of a social shaping of technology kind of argument. I just think that there's a little bit less of it in computer game representations because they're very tightly engineered to minimize multistability, right. Often at least. They really want you to know exactly what's going on. So that's just, thank you.
Just a matter of interest, I hope I was concentrating sufficiently, but I didn't hear you mention mirror neurons during your talk. Mirror neurons. I didn't hear you mention
I did not mention mirror neurons.
I just wondered if there was a specific reason for that, because there was the question about this idea of empathy or non-empathy with, etc. And there has been some kind of discussion around this theme. Do you have any thoughts on this mirror neuron in relation to your own position?
I will have to confess here to a sort of prejudice. My prejudice is I think that all of this stuff about the brain is far too overextended, far too primitive, and not well enough developed to draw very many conclusions. So I don't talk about mirror neurons at all. I try very hard to stay away, believe it or not, from cognitive science. I'm very much an actional embodiment kind of person, so it's just.
I don't think it has much to do with, but when you are playing with an avatar, how do you, this is a question, how do you place the involvement of your actions inside the world or outside in real world? How do you locate the involvement that your actions have with your emotional world? Do you?
I think computer games and going to theaters and so forth are all very much alike. And you know the old story of melodrama, where you have the poor renter behind in the rent, and the villain comes in and says, I'm going to take your house away, and the bumpkin from the audience comes up and punches out the villain. Now, I don't think anybody's ever seen that happen, but that's the usual story, because the bumpkin has not learned to sort of suspend the sense of what it means to be in a theater setting. Now, I think, frankly, that this happens with computer games as well. That is, you know in advance that you're not going to get killed. You know in advance that if you fall off the cliff, you're not going to break your leg, etc. This is part of the cultural, imaginative relationship that's going on with respect to that. Now, let's go to some different variations. One of the things that's really starting to disturb me, because I go to concerts a lot in spite of my hearing aids. Piano concerts are great. Certain violins frequencies I can no longer hear, but pianos are no problem. So I go to a lot of piano concerts, and it's really funny to me to look at the audience and see everybody's sort of sitting there listening to the piano. Why aren't they moving? In Africa, for example, a lot of the words for singing are the same as for dancing. And in fact, there's an anthropologist who's borrowed my notions of multistability in analyzing dancing therapies in a certain African tribe. We don't do that. I mean, the fact that we could sit here and listen to music, now I grant I might be tapping my feet or moving my knees accordingly, but that's also an acquired skill. So I think I only talked about bodily skills today, but you also have to talk about cultural skills, and the cultural skills include these things, such as the kind of distanciation and play-like activities accordingly.
So, thank you for the talk. I was thinking about when we talk about playing a game, it seems like we very often talk about different things. We have different ideas of what it is to play a game or how people play a game. And your idea with multi-stable representations made me think that games as artifacts might be multi-stable in what type of activities they make people do. Have you been thinking in those terms? Because you've been talking about playing games, but you haven't been talking about playing one game in different ways. But it seems like your idea multi-stable would explain why people play it quite differently and would give a way of linking that and talking about it.
I do want to make two very strong points with respect to multistability, etc. In the first edition, I talk about this to a certain extent. You could have, let's say, an imagined culture. You could have an imagined culture that could theoretically see this as a Mayan pyramid only. Let's say this is a culture which lives in the Mayan area and sees these things, etc. So not only does the first instance be a Mayan pyramid, but that's the only way they take it. People who go to theater and see proscenium stages could be such a literal mind, I call it literal-minded culture. But my argument is, once you see it multistably, you can't go back to see it as only one thing. You become polymorphic-minded, as it were. Now, I think this is actually a trajectory of development, a trajectory of critical development. In a multi-stable universe, you can't be a fundamentalist. That's simply an impossibility. And now you might guess, you're right, I'm very anti-fundamentalist, regardless of whether you're talking about religion or metaphysics or anything else. So I think that's one of the implications of multistability. I'll settle for that right now.
You are my last question.
So, in a lot of writing in game studies, media studies, and presence research, when theorists comment about the sense of being in an environment, it's usually tends to be taken for granted that a first-person view is going to place the player more inside the environment, or give them a sense of being in the environment, more than a third-person view, like piggybacking on an avatar, as you mentioned. When interviewing players on the phenomenon, that didn't seem to be the case at all. And from my own personal sort of introspection, that isn't the case either. I mean, initially maybe there is this distance for the first maybe hours, but then one seems to sort of assimilate that on-screen body and see beyond it, and you completely forget. You kind of skirted around this a little bit, so I was wondering if you could address this issue in terms of multistability.
I probably can't because I'm not an avid player. I will grant your point. I would have to become one, in a sense, to more thoroughly recognize what you're after. But that's an interesting point.
Okay, I think we're out of time. Thank you for the talk.